Thank you for joining me, Mr. Rader. What began your desire to dive into the sports broadcasting field?
Well, when I was a senior in high school, when I wasn't playing sports, I wanted to write about sports. So I got a job covering high school sports when I wasn't playing for a weekly newspaper called the Montgomery County Sentinel in Maryland. And then I was asked to write stories for the Washington Post on a freelance basis, so I did that. And then when I was a freshman at the University of Maryland, I got a job working for a local radio station in Washington, and I did high school football play-by-play, and I did a University of Maryland basketball show called Terrapin Talk. And then the spring of my sophomore year in college, I was offered an internship by ABC Sports, and I started working with them as an intern until during my second semester of my sophomore year, and that's how I got interested in the business.
Right. The first TV station that you worked at, which was the first one that you were employed at, and what was the most important lesson you learned firsthand at that station?
The first television station I was employed at was the ABC television station in Washington, D.C., because I parlayed my internship working for ABC into a job at that television station. And one of the more interesting things that I've learned that I remember to this day, and I think I probably told you this story when you were an intern here at WAVY last year, is because it's a story that I always tell my interns about how important it is to make sure that when you give someone information, it's the correct information. And what happened was that I was working as a producer for, at the time, the sports director, Steve Bassett, and there was an NBA player that had been from the Washington, D.C. area. And my boss was not from the Washington, D.C. area, but he was the sports guy, and he was the guy that was on TV. And we were doing a story about this NBA player who was from the Washington area, and my boss said to me, "What high school did he go to?" And I was almost sure that I knew, and I gave him the name of a high school. Well, my boss went on TV, and he mentioned the name of the high school, and it was the wrong high school. It was like the high school next to that he went to. Well, obviously, the phones lit up, and that was back before email. But the phones lit up, and all the viewers called up to tell my boss what an idiot he was, because if he was going to do sports in Washington, he should know that so-and-so went to this high school, not the other one. And boy, did my boss light into me. And he made a statement at the time, which is obviously a little over-exaggerated, but he said, "There are only two jobs in the world where the people expect you to be perfect. One is being a brain surgeon, and the other is being a television sportscaster." And he said, "And you make sure that if I ask you a question, if you aren't 100% sure of what that answer is, you better damn well go out and make sure you get the answer."
Wow, you didn't tell me that story.
I didn't tell you that story? All right, well, good. Now you know it. And I should have told you that story before because it's very important.
All right. What would you say is the most memorable interview that you yourself have done, and how did you prepare for that interview?
Oh, wow. You know, it's funny because I don't really do a lot of preparation for interviews. You know, most of the interviews that I have done in my career have been in situations where I was covering an event and something happened during that event, and after the event was over, I had to do an interview about that event, so it just depended on the individual who had the big game, who didn't have the big game. I'll tell you a funny story. This, and a lot of you all that are watching this may be too young to even remember, but the Washington Redskins back in the 80s used to actually be very good. And they actually played in Super Bowls and they won Super Bowls. Well, in this one particular instance, they did not win the Super Bowl. They lost to the LA Raiders. The Super Bowl was in Tampa. And the Redskins had this great running back by the name of John Riggins, who if you are a Redskins fan, you know it even if you never saw him. But anyway, he was a very temperamental person, and he did not like the media, and he didn't like doing interviews. Well, the Redskins lost to Tampa in the Super Bowl, and after the game was over, John, who normally did not talk to the media at all, did make an exception on that particular night and say, I'm going to do interviews. So he did an interview with some reporters after the game, and at the time I was in the Raiders locker room. So after I got finished in the Raiders locker room, I went into the Redskins locker room, and I went up to John Riggins, who was dressing in his locker, and I said, hey, John, do you have a second? I'd like to talk to you about the game. And without turning around, he said, look, I've already talked to the media, and I'm not talking anymore. And I went, John, come on. I just want to ask you a couple of questions. And he said, I already talked to the media. I don't want to talk to anybody anymore. Now, John Riggins was a very, very big guy, a heck of a lot bigger than I am. And he was known for being very temperamental. And I said, John, really? I said, you can't just answer one question for me? And he stopped. And he turned around and he looked at me and he said, what part of me not wanting to do an interview with you did you not understand? And all of a sudden, I felt the microphone in my hand being pulled away, and I looked behind me, and my cameraman was hightailing it on the other side of the locker room. And he was thinking, in effect, you know what, you want to stand there and argue with that guy? You can. But I'll tell you one thing, I'm not going to do it. And then another one that wasn't quite as humorous, but it's something that I'll always remember, is that Dale Earnhardt, Sr., was also one of those types of individuals that did not like talking to the media. Mm-hmm. And he just didn't talk to the media very often. And he was a very surly character. And he was not just surly to the media, but he was also kind of surly to the fans. And he was just kind of like that rebel type of an athlete that, nobody really wanted to be around because they were sort of afraid of him. And for years and years and years, he had tried to win the Daytona 500. And he never could win the Daytona 500. He was the greatest NASCAR driver that there was, but he could never win the Super Bowl, the Daytona 500. And then finally one year, he won the Daytona 500. And so I was there in Daytona, and the race was maybe over at 6 o'clock, and Earnhardt had gone, and he had, done Victory Lane, and then he had gone and done all the newspaper reporters, and then he had talked to, like, ESPN and all of that. And his PR guy, who I was friends with, said, if you'll wait around, Dale will come down to Victory Lane at some point tonight, and he will do an interview with you. So I said, we will wait. So it's Sunday night at Daytona. All the fans have gone. It's dark, maybe 3 hours after the race is over. And sure enough, here comes Dale Earnhardt. And he walks in to do the interview. Well, you're never really sure what's going to happen with Earnhardt because he doesn't really like talking to the media. Well, through the time from he won the race until the time that he came to me, and considering the fact that his car was actually sponsored by Budweiser, Dale had had a few beers. And he came and sat down. And it was really one of the best interviews I ever did in my entire life. He was so happy. He was a little, a little talkative because of the beer. And we did a great interview. And then that night at 11 o'clock, I ran the interview. And at the end, I came back on the live shot and I said, so Dale Earnhardt finally wins the Daytona 500. And you know what? It even kind of makes you like the guy.
Oh, it's a great story. If you could sum up your experiences throughout your career as a broadcaster, how have they shaped you into the on-air talent that you're known as today?
Well, I think it's a little different with me because of the fact that I started on television here in Hampton Roads when I was 22 years old. I didn't have a style. I had hair down to here. I was 22 years old. I looked like I was probably about 15 at the time. I had no television experience whatsoever. Now, that's something that would never happen in a market this size today. Back 40 years ago, it was a smaller town and a smaller television market. So really, pretty much what happened was that I didn't really have anybody to learn from. I never, worked for a sports guy for 15 years and was able to, learn from him. I just sort of kind of made up my own style. And one of the things was I just really enjoyed what I was doing. And I really liked sports. And I liked being on TV. And I liked living here. And I think what happened was that I showed that enthusiasm. it's funny because now that I've been on TV here for almost 40 years now, the vast majority of people that I meet over the years, and they come up to me and they say, "Oh, I've watched you on television forever and ever and ever," and they go, "I love watching you because you get so excited. I love watching you because you're so enthusiastic." Very seldom do they say, "I love watching you because you know more about sports than anybody else I've ever watched." And, you can take that as an insult, but I don't think that that's what it is. But that is what I think sticks out in the viewer's mind, people that have watched me for a really long time, is that they just think that I guess maybe after you've watched the news for 45 minutes or 20 minutes and you see all the bad things that happen, it's kind of nice to see somebody that actually is having some fun. And so I think that's probably what molded me was myself.
If you could give one piece of advice to aspiring students at ODU that want to get into the sports broadcasting field, just your own advice, what would that be?
Don't do it. I think a lot of old people that are in any sort of business, whether they're in politics or whatever, they say, "Don't do it." The media's changed dramatically, and I'm sure that this is something that you have learned in college, and if you haven't, then you should have. But it's just the media coverage in the way things are, especially in television, has dramatically changed over the last 10 years and certainly over the last 40 from when I started. Nowadays, everyone is expected to be able to do everything. And that means that if you want to be on television, you have got to be prepared to not only have presence on television, but you have to be prepared to know how to shoot a camera. You have to be prepared to know how to edit what it is that you shoot. You have to know and be prepared to write. You have to be prepared to find stories. You have to be prepared to know how to anchor. The days of someone coming into a job, especially right out of college, and just being able to sit on a television set or grab a microphone and be on TV, those days are long, long gone. So that's what you have to do. And then the other thing is that you have to be prepared to go on job interviews into very, very small markets and work very, very hard doing all of those things and make a very small amount of money and hope that maybe you can work your way up the ladder. And this has happened to me. The two longtime sportscasters in Greenville, North Carolina, where East Carolina is, an hour and a half away from here, they've both been the sports directors of their respective television stations for now well over 20 years. They both were interns for me when they were at Old Dominion. And now their children have graduated from college. But I had told them, if you think you're going to get a job working in Norfolk right out of ODU, it's not happening. They went to Greenville. What happened to make it even worse for the up-and-coming students is they stayed there. They didn't move on. So those are two jobs that weren't even available anymore. Nathan Epstein, who does the weekend sports for us now, he was a sports intern for me when he was at, I think he went to Longwood, and he left after college, and he got a job in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, doing weekends, making no money, and then was lucky enough to get a job back here where he's from. And so you have to be prepared to make those sacrifices. It's not easy, and more television stations around the nation are not even doing local sports anymore. And so that just cuts the jobs down even more. So, and the other thing too is that you have to be very conscious of is how important it is to be able to contribute to the web, because all of the television stations now are very active in the web. And not only are you expected to do your television work, but you're also expected to contribute to the web every single day, along with everything else that you do. So there's a lot of competition out there, and you just have to really want it bad enough that you're willing to make the sacrifices, because you're going to have to make sacrifices.
Okay. Describe your job.